This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Happy 4th of July, almost. This is another episode of 9/11 Freefall. I am your host, Andy Steele. My guest tonight is Gary Mackenzie. Gary is an expert in drilling and blasting and has had some experience bringing down buildings as well. He'll be talking about the 9/11 controlled demolitions, the fact that Towers 1, 2, and 7 of the World Trade Center complex were brought down with explosives that day. Talk about the art of bringing things down and blowing things up in this interview tonight. So stay tuned. I'll be playing that for you in a couple of minutes or so. I'm having a really good 4th of July week. Actually, it started about the week before the 4th of July. I drove across America. So this was a very good experience. Got a chance to see a lot of the country. The reason I was driving across country is I had to take care of some personal business for family members. And so I ended up driving from New York to Arizona. And one thing I learned firsthand is that there is a lot of desert here in the United States of America. An awful lot of desert, and it's really, really hot. But I'm very happy to have had this opportunity. You get to see these places that you only know of as existing on a map in certain times, or just quick snapshots of them in movies or before football games. And it's something that I recommend everybody take time to do. People talk about driving. I did it about 3 days. So the driving is not that bad. I enjoyed every second of it. All right, I got some news to go over before I play tonight's interview. There was a press release that went out, I believe it was last week, from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. It's called Architects and Engineers Call for Expansion of Transparency Act for 9/11 Families. If you recall, Senator Rand Paul, who's running for president, and former Senator Bob Graham and other U.S. congressmen have introduced bipartisan legislation calling for the release of the redacted 28 pages from the 9/11 Joint Congressional Inquiry from 2002, I believe it was. Basically, the 28 pages supposedly point to Saudi Arabian involvement in the attacks. The Saudi Arabian government, the royal family, which is intertwined with the Bush family. So it could be pretty embarrassing for the Bush family. Pretty embarrassing, too, for people who have overlooked this all these years. So I'm going to read this press release to you. It says, last week, several members of the U.S. Congress, including Senator Rand Paul and former Senator Bob Graham, announced new bipartisan legislation. S-1471, known as the Transparency for the Families of 9/11 Victims and Survivors Act of 2015, would require President Obama to declassify and make available to the public the 28 redacted pages of the joint inquiry into intelligence community activities before and after the terrorist attacks of September 2001. Though the mission of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth remains solely focused on analyzing the scientific evidence surrounding the destruction of World Trade Center Buildings 1, 2, and 7 on September 11, 2001, we stand shoulder to shoulder with the spirit of S-1471. Not only do we seek answers for the 9/11 victims' families, several of whom we represent, but we also call upon Congress to further extend this bid for transparency by mandating the following. 1. The release by the National Institute of Standards and Technology of the input data that it used to generate computer models of WTC-7. From that data, NIST conceived the hypothesis that normal office fires completely destroy that 47-story steel frame tower symmetrically at free fall acceleration in just seconds. So far, NIST has denied the Freedom of Information Act request for the computer data on the basis that releasing it might, quote-unquote, jeopardize public safety. 2. A thorough review of NIST's thermal expansion hypothesis as the stated cause for World Trade Center 7's destruction. This hypothesis is based on a flawed analysis that omits important facts, notably the presence of stiffener plates that would have prevented thermal expansion of the steel beams, which NIST claims precipitated the entire structure's freefall collapse. 3. An incorporation into NIST's analysis of the long-span beam sagging in World Trade Center 7 that surely would have taken place had the high temperatures NIST claims were reached actually been achieved. A floor beam's ability to push on the girder it is connected to diminishes when some of the extra length gained from the thermal expansion is lost to downward bowing, a fact that calls into question NIST's entire thermal expansion hypothesis. Number 4, an accounting from NIST of how it determined that fires were raging on the 12th floor of World Trade Center 7 in the area of the alleged collapse initiation when the building fell at 5:20 p.m., when photographic evidence proves that the fire had burned itself out there more than an hour earlier. 5. Thorough testing as recommended by the National Fire Protection Association's NFPA 921 guide of World Trade Center dust samples for the purpose of detecting incendiaries or explosives. To date, NIST has refused to do such tests. Its officials argue that because they do not expect to find the presence of such materials, they do not need to look for them. The determination of these facts is vital to developing a more complete picture of what really happened in New York City on that ill-fated day. At the very least, 9/11 constitutes a failure by the federal government to do its important job of protecting Americans from a terrorist attack on our own soil. The 2,350 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth hold that all U.S. and world citizens, including the families of 9/11 victims, deserve a full, open, impartial, scientific inquiry into the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center towers. And folks, with those 5 points that AE is requesting that the government mandate, those are the most reasonable things that anybody in this movement could ask for, on either side. Again, as the press release states, this constitutes a massive failure by the federal government, so everything should be open. Everything should be laid bare. All right, just like questioning congressmen on live television about scientific facts, if they stonewall, they look unreasonable. They look foolish. They look like the ones who are not willing to cooperate. So we got to take a copy of this press release to every news outlet we can and to every congressman that we can and make them live up to the call for 9/11 transparency. All right, before I play my interview with Gary Mackenzie, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We'll do that beginning now. And that's 10 seconds. Gary Mackenzie has extensive experience with explosive applications that very few people have. He'll be telling us more about it in his great career, but he's worked at 4 different mines and has his own blasting business. He's used many types of explosives and detonators. Exciting stuff. Sounds like a lot of fun, or a fun career to have. Gary, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you very much.
And also, too, I always forget to mention this in my intros for the presenters team guys, but he's on AE 9/11 Truth's presenters team also. So he's going to be getting out there at some point and going over the controlled demolition evidence with the supporters and with the people who may not be awake to this evidence yet. But Gary, that's a very quick background I gave, so please elaborate on your history, your career. Tell us more about yourself and what you've done with your life.
Okay, my name is Gary Mackenzie, 62 years old, been married 40 years, have 2 children. Was an underground miner. I will explain what mines and where and what I did. I started as underground working for a Hecla Lakeshore mine. Hecla is a silver mining company based in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I started as a slusher operator. And then I was given the opportunity to go to mine school to learn to be a face miner. But I didn't think that was a good idea, so I went to Wyoming in 1976 after a year at Hecla. And I worked for United Nuclear as a grade B miner, jackleg drilling with hand-lit fuses. It was a very archaic form of blasting. We used 40% sticks of dynamite for priming the hole, and ammonium nitrate when it was economical. If not, I filled the hole with more sticks of dynamite. And I worked there for a year, and then I went back to Hecla Lakeshore Mine, where I was now qualified as a grade B miner. I worked as an undercut miner, which means you go underneath the ore body and blast it all down to one level, where it gets taken out, the ore gets taken out on muck trains, and then shipped to the surface, where it's crushed and processed. It was 8 by 8 foot drifts with a lot of ground support, mostly timber and steel. And then I was a surface miner. When the mine closed in 1979 because of the price of copper, I started surface mining as a drilling and blasting specialist for gold dredge miners who needed better access to their gold. And then I worked in 1980 to 81 for Kerr McGee in Gallup, New Mexico, as a stope miner. Stope miner is a person who follows the ore body wherever it goes, up, down, sideways, it doesn't matter. You follow the high-grade ore. And that lasted, I was in a uranium mine, and it was a very dangerous situation, and I didn't like the lack of ground support there. So I quit, and I went to Tooele, Utah. I worked for Anaconda Copper Company as a lead base miner, which means I drove development drifts 14.5 feet high by 14 feet wide without any ground support whatsoever. The ground was so stable that if you blasted it properly, it didn't rain rocks down on you. We used jumbo drills, which is an automatic drill, which is totally opposite of jackleg drilling, which is very dangerous. It has 14-foot booms, and you drill holes in a pattern so that the ground does not crack in the wrong directions. I worked there for 2 years, and then in 1984 to 87, I became a lift mechanic at Homewood Ski Area in Lake Tahoe, where I did a lot of structural steel work, a lot of welding, a lot of cutting, and I was their blasting expert. Built roads for them and blasted boulders that were in the way of the ski runs. Then from 1988 to 1992, I worked for Carver Construction. We mostly did road base for Georgia Pacific and Louisiana Pacific to get to their timber stands. 1 week a month I did that, and we had other jobs, some very complicated. We built sewage plants for Shelter Cove, California, and I started my own blasting business in '84 when I became a lift mechanic. I was blasting license number 6191 in California. For Carver, I did one 4-story building. It was to take it out so they could put in a strip mall. And then we did a lot of other silos and different types of applications for blasting there. I was their lead blaster. 1988 to 1997, I had my own business also in Tahoe, and did mostly driveways, sewer lines, water lines, in decomposed granite and granite. And my biggest job was Home Run, it's called. It's a ski run at Squaw Valley, California. It was 12 feet wide, and they wanted it 90 feet wide. So I did that job. It was quite successful. I used mostly slurries, which is a type of explosive that you use when you're in water, especially. 40-foot holes maximum, and we shot anywhere from, I was the only one on the job blasting, 12,000 to 22,000 pounds at a time. Now I'm presently a gold prospector, but it's very hard to get around the legal problems here in California. So that's my expertise in terms of explosives. I have no military ordnance experience, and I have no experience with nanothermite. I know of it, but I never was able to use it because it didn't work for commercial applications. That's about the extent of experience. I have like I said, experience with prels, which is ammonium nitrate, different qualities of dynamite, detonator cord, and many different types of detonators, electric and non-electric.
So how did you, and I'm going to ask you about that nanothermite thing in just a moment that you just mentioned, because it's an intriguing thing you said. But before we get to that, how did you wake up to 9/11, and why are you on our team now talking about it?
Well, I joined the team as soon as I found out 9/11 Truth was there. When I was watching it on television, I was living in Arizona at that time. I told my wife and children at the moments we were watching it that it was not possible for that type of scenario to happen. First of all, the structural steel would have held up much better, and you wouldn't have dust from fires and the pressure of the pancake theory that it came up with at first. There was too much materials flying out of the building, and that upset me quite a bit, because I know that doesn't happen. And myself, I've never had a whole fire with any kind of subsidence or rocks. They call it fly rock. I've never had rocks fly out of holes or anything like that. It's all controlled quite well. I've done jobs on Highway 80 and Highway 20 in California, and they had equipment lined up, and I've never had to have them use it to take care of fly rock, which they experience with other blasters.
So, when comparing a natural collapse to a controlled demolition, what are the key distinctive features that we should be looking for? Like when we do these side-by-side comparisons, let's say we watch a building that legitimately caught fire and may have, be a natural fire collapse versus, something that is an acknowledged controlled demolition.
Well, the key to controlled demolitions is the footprint that you leave, and the fact that you don't want anything flying out of the building towards a crowd that usually is standing there watching, because a lot of times they announce when they're going to bring down a building, like Las Vegas. There was a large crowd there, and you don't want anything to fly out and injure somebody, because you won't have your license very long. So that usually doesn't happen, and then you want the center of the building to come down first, and then have everything pile into that. So it's done in milliseconds on the delays of the primer.
Okay. So when you saw Building 7, for instance, coming down, and some of this might seem like no-brainer, kind of rhetorical, but if it's rhetorical, it's because there's a lot of truth to the statement. But what made you know that was a controlled demolition, just watching that come down?
Well, structural steel doesn't act that way when you are when it's just fire. It'll burn one direction or another due to wind, due to the strength of the steel, due to the size of the building. It won't start in the middle and just burn in the middle and create a void for the rest of the building to fall into. I've never seen that, and never even heard of anything like that happening. So, and global collapse of a building like that is just not possible. It's supported in many different directions.
Right, and so, as we've kind of boiled down to in layman's terms on this show before, what you should be seeing, what we have seen in actual fire collapses, we've never seen a full collapse like we saw in 9/11 with Building 7, but when a high-rise catches on fire, pieces of it might fall off at certain points after burning for a long time, but you should still have the majority of the steel frame skeleton standing at the end of the day after the fire is put out. This is what we see. 9/11 was an unprecedented event. An unprecedented event that was predicted somewhere like 20 minutes ahead of time.
Well, the heat is the key to structural steel. You can't get a fire hot enough with natural materials to burn like that and melt steel. structural steel burns at such a high temperature that you can't get to that temperature with jet fuel or whatever's in the office or any other application that would be in a building. And they never did any, according to the reports I read, the 9/11 Truth and the 9/11 Commission and the NIST reports. They ignored explosives and never checked for them. So it was kind of strange that they wouldn't check for the obvious solution to the problem.
Now, I was a young whippersnapper coming up. I wanted to apprentice you, and I said, Mr. Mackenzie, I can save us a lot of money. Why don't we just, because let's say we get our first controlled demolition contract together. I say, Mr. Mackenzie, let's save a lot of money. Let's start some random fires, kerosene from the jet fuel, and we can watch the building come down. What would you say to me?
That's not possible. Like I said, the temperatures can't from what I understand and have read many places, even places that have nothing to do with 9/11, the temperatures won't get past 1,600 degrees. And structural steel burns at a much higher temperature.
Right, and even NIST acknowledges this. I mean, they have to acknowledge this because this is something that is very provable. It doesn't start to melt structural steel until 2,750 degrees. NIST points that out themselves. So we're not going to start Andy's controlled demolition company by starting random fires anytime soon. So I'll have to find something else to do for a career. Now you mentioned how nanothermite is not used for commercial purposes. From what you know, what is it used for?
It was originally invented, I believe, by Lawrence Livermore Labs. And what they used it for was military applications for directing explosive charges, and where they needed to melt steel and structural supports. That's what I've read and seen in the companies that are involved, like Komatsu, one of their subsidiaries. I saw a video of theirs that was showing how thermite and nanothermite react with steel.
So, and I guess as I imagine this, what the military's purposes for bringing down buildings are, I imagine if they have an operation where they want someone to sneak in and take out some kind of structure, some steel structure, this is why they created it. Am I correct in that assessment, or is there some more practical use that I'm missing here?
Yes, that's correct. But also, the military runs into structures that are reinforced, many feet thick, and a lot of times bombs won't penetrate the structure. And then you can also use it underwater in encased form to take out obstacles to get to beaches or landing areas, or that's what I assume they would use it for.
And what should be troubling here is this is not a material that you can just go to your regular channels and get, if I understand it. This is something that the military pretty much solely has access to, as far as I know. I haven't checked every single source that could get access to it, but I mean, if you wanted to go through your normal channels for a job, could you get nanothermite?
No, I bought all of my explosives at Alpha Powder Company in Lincoln, California, and I could get up to 80% nitroglycerin sticks and up to 500 milligrams per inch of detonator cord. That's maximum. I would never use either one of those for my blasting purposes, because it's just uncontrollable at that point, and you have to use blasting mats and other protective devices to keep anything from flying out of the holes.
Now, just as a side question, not even related to 9/11, I'm just curious. You could only get certain amounts of things. Was that in just one purchase? Could you go back the next day and get more of it, or did you have to tell the government what kind of job you're doing, and then they keep track of that?
No, my license allowed me to buy any amount, Like I said, most I've ever had to buy was 22,000 pounds, and that's a semi truck full. So I've never had to buy any more than that, and they never asked me any questions about what I was using it for or where I was using it. I did file reports with the insurance companies of how I was using it, where I was using it, what type of detonator I was using, how I was going to time it, and what directions the holes were blasting. And then I had to set up, at times when I was in subdivisions or next to houses or next to bigger buildings, I would also take a seismograph to show which direction each charge went.
Interesting. So I'm going to ask you questions that are naturally come to people's minds when they start being confronted with this evidence. And I'll tell you what, we focus a lot on the physics of the building demolitions on this show. We talk about the presence of melted steel. We look at what was left over after these buildings were brought down. But I don't know if we've actually explored kind of the how it could have been done type of scenario. And we stick to the hard science here. We stick to the facts. And so I qualify it if it's speculation. And at this point, it is speculative. We don't know how explosives were brought into the buildings. But we have somebody that knows what he's talking about when it comes to explosives. So I want to pick your brain here and do some wargaming, I guess, for a scenario where it could have been brought in. First of all, what would be the minimum amount of access to the buildings that would have been needed to pull off the controlled demolitions? Considering you've got at least 3 here buildings, 47 stories tall for one of them, 110 stories for 2 of them. What would be the minimum amount of access that they would have needed to be able to plan this out?
Well, on the Twin Towers, they had a structure within a structure. So you would have to have access to the elevators, to the main support beams, and you would have to do some cutting to get the charges placed properly. And then it would have to be timed perfectly. Like I said, it's in milliseconds. And underground, I would not hear the difference between 0, which is your first charge going off, and up to 2,500 milliseconds. I wouldn't hear the difference between the first charge and the last 2,500 second charge going off. It's less than a second. So that would be really hard to do without people noticing, unless you disguise the charge and, like I said, cut the proper areas where you wanted to take out the support. And then you would have to implode the outside to the inside to get it to come down like that. And it would take quite a bit in terms of pounds of explosive to make that effect. So I assume this was planned way in advance. You would have to engineer the explosive part of it. Literally, you'd have to have a really good engineer, explosive engineer, to design that.
Well, if whoever did it is listening right now, maybe he's getting some kind of sick thrill out of hearing that. That was my next question, actually, because I wonder about this. I wonder about how long in advance this was being planned. I mean, I was living my life in 2000 like so many of us were. In fact, I went to New York about a year before I was at the site of the World Trade Center. Didn't bother to even really take any note of it or reflect on the moment because I didn't know that they would be disappeared in a year. But, I mean, how far in advance would, minimum amount of time in advance would they have had to set this up?
Well, with supercomputers now, you could design it in less than a week. But to actually set the charges and set the timers and the primers to go off in the proper order and at the proper time, that would take some effort. That would be at least a month.
At least, but I mean, a month to me is not a long time to do something this big.
No, exactly. You must have got quite a chill after seeing the buildings come down after being there a year before. I mean, that's too close.
Yeah, I think we all did on that day, and I talked to one guy and who was talking about how he had been there. I think it was in April, so very very close to it. And so when it was happening, he was there on a class field trip of some kind. And now he's awake to the controlled demolition evidence, so that kind of messes with his head a little bit, knowing that he had just been there. But a month in the big scheme of things is not a long time to set something up. And you say at a minimum, is that, since you said a minimum, is that a realistic time frame?
No, I think a crew of 20 could pull that off in a month.
A crew of 20. That's not a lot of people. That's interesting, huh? So I wanted to ask you about a few... Well, actually, before I even get to my points, I forgot I wanted to ask this question, too. What would have been the minimum amount of materials needed to bring them down? I think you actually might have cited this, like several tons of explosives, right?
Oh, no. I would, if I was to do the job personally, I would expect to use, between 5,000 and 8,000 pounds.
And I guess, because we were trying to get an assessment of what is actually happened that morning. Again, what we're basing it off of is what is found on the crime scene. We're finding the materials, the nanothermite and the dust. There was explosions going off that morning. People hearing them. Bap, 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 like a belt going around. And, there was explosions, according to some sources, they were hearing it before the buildings came down. For instance, like Building 7, there's video of firefighters on a payphone, and you hear an explosion go off, boom, boom, and one of them says, we got to get out of here, 7 is exploding. But this wasn't the moment the building came down. So, what is going on there? Do you hypothesize? Again, we don't know for certain, but just proposing a hypothesis here. What is going on there? Why are we hearing explosions before the actual buildings go down?
Like I was trying to explain earlier, you would have to take out the inside of the building. In terms of the towers, you would, I'll get to Building 7 in a second, but in the towers, you would have to take out the middle of the building, the bottom floors, to have an area to cave the rest of the building into, to get it to go into its own footprint. And Building 7, you would definitely have to take out the main elevators, the main supports on the inside. You wouldn't see any evidence of it on the outside until the building was actually falling. But on the inside, you would have a void, which everything blasts into, just like I would do in a face round underground. I have to take out the inside of the... If you're looking at a wall face, you have to take. You can put it's called a burn. You take out the burn, which is the center of the round. You drill a hole that you blast the next 4 holes into. You put zeros on the 4 holes on outside where you're going to blast that 1 hole into, and then you go 100 milliseconds around that, and then 200 milliseconds, and you just go in a circle, and everything caves into itself, into that middle hole. And then the last holes to go off are called lifters. Those are the bottom holes, and they fire everything out into the void where you're drilling from, and it makes a nice flat muck pile. So you can get into your loaders and then dump it wherever it goes, into a chute or into a train.
So is this standard practice? For instance, like if I was going to go watch a hotel get brought down, obviously there's the moment when the whole building comes down and everybody cheers, but would it be standard practice to do all of this preliminary explosive work before you see the coup de grace and the building come down?
Definitely. You have to have an area that's void of material or structural support to bring everything into. Otherwise, it'll flow outside of its footprint, and it wouldn't fall into its own footprint without somewhere for that material to go.
Okay, and so I just want to establish this because it doesn't seem, from what I'm hearing you say, that eliminating parts of the building ahead of time is something that they would just do to be sneaky so that they can deceive everybody and make it think it was a natural collapse. This is a standard thing that happens with controlled demolitions. People get this impression that they just hit one button and everything goes and the building comes down, but there's a lot of preliminary explosive work taking place within the building so that the final explosion, the detonation of the building is clean and we see it come down beautifully and it doesn't hurt anybody. That's basically what you're telling me.
That's correct. You have to take out the main supports on the inside first and have enough of a force to make that into like the inside of a ball with air in it, a basketball, for instance. You would have to have the inside of that void of any kind of structural support, any kind of interference in terms of where you want the material to go to, and in terms of acceleration, you want the proper acceleration of that material to be such that it piles on top of each other. Each individual detonator, even if you use the 10, like underground, if you use a 10 number 1 100 millisecond delay primer, then all of those would go up at the same time but end up in the same exact void. And then the other ones outside of that. And this is going off so fast that you can't hear the difference. Because, like I said, it's in milliseconds. You can't hear 1 millisecond to 1,000 milliseconds. That would be 1 second, or 1/10 second.
I think there's some synchronicity going on between us here, because this leads right into my next question. I got point number 13 on the NIST FAQ for their report on Building 7. It says, did investigators consider the possibility that an explosion caused or contributed to the collapse of WTC-7? And I'll just read the beginning of it. It says, yes, this possibility was investigated carefully. NIST concluded that blast events inside the building did not occur and found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast event. In addition, no blast sounds were heard on the audio tracks of video recordings during the collapse of World Trade Center 7 or reported by witnesses. So basically what you're saying is that while the building is coming down, they're so close together, you're not going to hear boom, 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 boom like that.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's correct. But at the same time, you heard many, I've heard many firemen, some of them with quite a high rank, that are experts at this, and you would hear the different sections being taken out because it's such a tall structure that you're not going to be able to fire or explode different shaped charges on the steel that would be either painted on or stuck on or adhesived on. You would have to take out certain sections, and let them fall, or start to fall, actually. It would never reach the bottom on that big of a structure. I've only done a 4-story building. That's the biggest building I've brought down. But in a big building like that, you would have a lot more control of the timing. So if you take out the bottom and the middle of the building, you have something to where you can fire everything else into, because it's no longer there. So you would hear different explosions going off, but they're taking out different sections all at once. Let's
talk about Detonation. Now, there's this movie called Operation Terror, and it portrayed it was sort of like the JFK of 9/11 truth. It gave a Hollywood version of what people think could have happened. It's not the definitive word on what happened on 9/11, but if there was some kind of conspiracy involved, they kind of lay out a story in which it tells you, how it could have happened. So in that movie, they portray the controlled demolition of the towers, the Twin Towers, taking place by remote control. Now, I don't know much about detonators. I just am curious, is it possible that a remote control detonator could have been used for something like this?
Yes, definitely. They have detonators that can be ignited remotely because of the frequency that they're set for. So you could have an explosion detonated from whatever the distance is between you and the setup, however they're setting up the connection, and it could be done remotely very easily as long as you have access to a line of sight to the detonator.
So in the movie, if I remember right, it's been a while since I saw it, so I hope the audience corrects me if I'm wrong in my remembrance of it, but I believe that it's a couple of people hiding behind some rocks pretty far off from the Twin Towers. There's some dialogue between them, and then the guy pushes the button and the buildings come down. Like I said, it's a pretty long distance away. Like you're seeing it almost like it's the New York City skyline is the way they portray it. How far away could they have been?
Oh, you could, like I said, with something like that, if you had the correct line of sight, you could be many miles away. You could be a good mile to 2 miles would be easy. Any further than that, you might have interference on your signal, depending on what frequency you're using.
Okay, so you would hypothesize that somebody could have been within a few miles and detonated this thing with just one push of a button. It's not unrealistic to think of it in that way.
That's not unrealistic at all. No, you could do that. I would do it that way. I wouldn't be near the building. What
steps should NIST have taken to investigate whether or not explosives were used? I mean, we talk about this all the time on the show, so it's become kind of passé to talk about how they didn't do a thorough investigation. But just as somebody who's worked in explosives, what should they have been looking for on the site to either confirm or rule out the use of incendiaries or explosives to bring these buildings down?
I would look first of all at the steel, at the structural steel. If it's cracked, that's really not possible due to fire. It'll bend first, and it doesn't bend very well either. You'd have to have a lot of heat to bend structural steel. You would have to look for cuts in the steel. I would assume it would be vertical cuts. That way you could tie the explosive charge, the shape charge, whatever you're using, to the steel easier. You wouldn't use detonator cord because that's too loud, and it creates too much of a flash. It burns at 24,000 feet per second, the 150 that I use, milligrams. So you wouldn't want to use anything like that. I don't even use that anymore myself. People always complain that are nearby of the force that they feel and the flash and just the loudness of it. So I would look for cuts in the steel, any kind of tearing of the steel, melting steel, because of, like I said, the temperatures would not allow the structural steel to melt. And there's plenty of visual evidence of that, so they should have been able to see that easily. And then in the dust, each explosive that you use has a signature chemical that's added to it, so they can track it down, where it came from, when it was made, who made it, and who bought it. So that would be the first two things I would look for. And then I would look for visual evidence of ejections from the building, which would be caused by the shape charge being too powerful for that specific structural support, which means that it would just have so much power that it would take out the structure faster than it could fall into the void.
With the squibs that we saw as the Twin Towers came down, is that a common thing that happens where you have a detonation take place too soon? Have you seen squibs in your experience?
Well, when you have a big building like that, that's a big job. And you wouldn't want any witnesses, for one thing. And you wouldn't want any obvious signs of an explosive being there. So accidents do happen, and it's rare. Underground, it's unheard of from a professional. I've never had a missed hole in my life. I've never had a round shotgun effect coming out of a hole where it went off, but there wasn't enough material. It's called inert material that you just shove in the hole to make the rest of the explosive stay in the hole, so that the entire length of the hole is blasted out. You don't want it to just fly out like a shotgun, because then you lose the whole round. You lose the cracking effect. You get bigger boulders, and they won't go through the grizzly. So you want every single hole to go off. And I've never had a missed hole ever, and even with hand lighting fuses. That way you do it by cutting the safety fuse according to how many feet you need. It burns at 42 seconds per foot. So that's how you time around when you're using old-time explosives. But in this case, yes, you could have that because of the fact that you're working on a time schedule, and there can be miscalculations due to a variety of factors: humidity, wind.
That is really fascinating, because I can just imagine this work being done now. And yeah, you got to figure that if they're doing this, they would be under a time schedule, and there could be mistakes made just because of the clandestine nature of it. So we're going to switch gears here, just talk more personally and philosophically. When you talk to colleagues about this, if you do, so first of all, I'm going to ask you if you do talk to people in your profession about this issue, and if you do, what do they say about it? What's their reaction?
Yes, I have talked to my old people that were on the same crew I was on. Some of them are still alive. One especially, he was a specialized blaster for undercuts, where he would go up into the cave area and take out any hang-ups from the rocks falling due to gravity. You want it to all come down into the track level, or, like I said, or chutes. And he agreed completely with me that when he saw the towers coming down, he went, "That's impossible." For the dust, concrete doesn't turn to dust easily. It has to have a lot of force, and then the way it came down in its own footprint, that has to be done professionally. That doesn't happen by accident in 3 buildings, much less 1. You know, I mean, 3 is impossible. 1 is highly unlikely. And a lot of people I know that they have a healthy fear of their government. They don't really want to talk about it besides me. They don't talk to anybody else about it like I do. I put it in front of people and make them come to their own conclusions. And I just put questions to them like, where did the energy come from to destroy a modern skyscraper that was designed to absorb airliner strikes? You know, and it's supposed to maintain its integrity, its structural integrity. And how did Building 7 come down due to a global collapse with minimal fire damage? I ask them questions like that, and they start to think, and then they start to hypothesize, and I explain to them why that can't happen either. And because hardly anybody, like I said, has the kind of experience that I do with explosives. I don't run into anybody on the street that would know anything about that. And then you have to, at the same time, you have to basically disprove Newton's laws of physics, especially the second and third. Acceleration, that's kind of obvious what's going on there. And then the force, when it says that for every force there's a reaction force that is equal in size but opposite in direction. Whenever an object pushes on another object, it gets pushed back in the opposite direction equally hard. Well, that didn't occur. So that's kind of hard to explain. You have to throw those laws out, and I don't remember when Newton was around, but it's been a long time since I've taken a physics class, but I do know that those theories have not been disproven.
Well, I think Isaac Newton was a conspiracy whack job because of the government's official story now. I mean, what crazy conspiracy theorists, because I'll tell you what, I mean, if NIST says it, they've disproven Isaac Newton with their computer models. So, of course, I'm kidding, folks.
Well, you have the Mach theory too. As far as the acceleration goes, Newton's not the only one to come up with this. But it's like I said, for one building to come down in its own footprint without controlled demolition is literally impossible. For three, it's unimaginable. It's preposterous, basically.
Well, they say everything changed on 9/11. Maybe physics did too. I don't know.
Well, I have a hard time with that one.
Now, I know that you've seen clips or just have been exposed to the media's reaction to this topic. You've laid out a reasonable case for why it should be at least investigated. What is your reaction to the media's treatment of this issue?
Well, I think I was listening to Dan Rather, and he said, this is a controlled demolition. And that was when it was happening. And then the next day, all of a sudden, it turned into, oh, well, it's a jet plane and the fuel caused this. Well, the fuel was burnt up in not enough time to melt steel. That would take a lot longer than a few minutes. Even if it was an hour.
Well, it couldn't. It can't melt steel.
No, exactly. And when they were watching it and explaining it on TV, almost all of them said it looked like a controlled demolition until the next day. And then all of a sudden, no, it wasn't, and whatever story they came up with. And then the molten steel, that all of a sudden disappeared too. It's like, we have no footage of that. And I saw it with my own eyes on television, and the fire burned for months. And how does a fire destroy a building and then stay on fire? The material would have put the fire out.
So, obviously, you wake up to 9/11 controlled demolition evidence. You see the media's reaction to it, the absolute hostility, not even just dismissing, but hostility to it, and you begin to question your world. How has waking up to this issue changed your view of the world that we're living in?
Boy, I was skeptical. I was taught to think, a lot more critically than most people. I went to Catholic school all my life until college, and we were always taught to think critically about many different subjects: faith, history, chemistry, physics. Just examine things. Don't take everything for face value. So I've never really thought that way. And when I see this, what affects me most is the sheer murder. There's no other way to explain it. I feel so sorry for the families. And to jump out of a building like that, when I talk to my friends about this, they all say the same thing. It would take a heck of an extreme situation for them to take that plunge. And I can't even imagine that. It's affected me quite heavily. I get really upset when I see stuff like that. And I've watched every angle that you can that I can get a hold of on YouTube. And like I said, I've read the NIST report, the 9/11 Commission report, and they didn't even really want to have an investigation to begin with, the Bush administration. So that's kind of strange to start with. And I have so many different problems with this. I also read the Pilots for 9/11 Truth page, and they say a lot of different things than we're working on, but you come to the same conclusion.
So, talking about solutions, because we're solution-oriented on this show, Just from your own knowledge and experience, what are some of the small things that our listeners can do every single day to get the word out and win this information war that this issue has become?
I think the first most important thing is educate yourself. Do some reading, do some research on your own. Don't take for face value whatever the propaganda that's being laid out is. If you want to just bury your head in the sand and make believe that the laws of physics don't work, and this story about airliners destroying buildings, the Empire State Building was hit by a plane in the 50s sometime, and they had a small area, about 8 stories I think it was, that was damaged, but there was no structural failure there. And I know we're dealing with a lot bigger airliner and a lot more fuel and a lot more force, but still the basics are there. Like I was trying to explain, the World Trade Centers, there was a structure within a structure. So I don't understand how you can get the plane to hit on one side of the building and have it start to fall in the direction of where that plane hit, where the destruction was, and then fall back the opposite direction. I don't see how that would happen unless, like I said, there was a void there for it to fall into.
Now, in our last couple of minutes here, do you have any final thoughts, anything that gives you hope, anything you want to leave our audience with for this interview to leave an impression of your insight on this issue?
Yes. To be without hope is to give up. And I don't believe in giving up. I believe we can fix our government. It has some problems, and it takes people, we the people, to fix it. So the more educated you become about it, the more you can explain it to other people and pass that information on. And there's so many forms of communication now that you can really reach a lot of people with modern day technology. And I don't believe in giving up and just accepting what happened. We need the truth, and we need to fix whatever the problem was.
Gary Mackenzie, thank you so much for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you for your time.
This program's on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download MP3s of the show from the Internet Archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and happy 4th of July.